The United States did not drift quietly into civil war. It was pulled toward it by a conflict so deep, so bitter, and so explosive that decade after decade of compromise failed to stop it. At the center of that crisis was slavery, not just as a labor system, but as a moral question, a political battleground, and a dividing line between two different visions of America. For generations, leaders tried to keep the country together by avoiding the deepest issue, but each attempt to delay the reckoning only made the fracture worse. By 1861, the nation was no longer simply debating policy. It was tearing itself apart over what kind of country it would be, and whether it could continue to exist half slave and half free. From the beginning, the United States carried a contradiction at its heart. The nation declared that all men are created equal, yet slavery remained legal and deeply rooted in American life. In the South, slavery became central to the economy and social order. In the North, slavery gradually declined, and anti-slavery attitudes slowly gained strength. But the Constitution did not solve the problem. It created a union while leaving the slavery question dangerously unresolved. That choice helped hold the young republic together for a time, but it also ensured that the conflict would grow larger as the country expanded. The nation was founded with a promise of liberty, but built with a wound that never healed. As the United States expanded westward, the crisis grew with it. The invention of the cotton gin made enslaved labor even more profitable, and cotton transformed the Southern economy. At the same time, every new territory entering the national conversation raised a terrifying question. Would it become free soil or slave soil? That question mattered because every new state shifted the balance of power in Congress. Southern leaders feared a future in which slavery would be surrounded, weakened, and eventually destroyed. Northern leaders increasingly feared that slaveholding interests were expanding their grip on the nation. The map of the United States became more than a geography lesson. It became a battleground over power, labor, freedom, and the future of the Republic. For decades, national leaders tried to contain the growing crisis through compromise. The Missouri Compromise attempted to preserve balance by drawing a line across the map. The Compromise of 1850 tried once again to calm sectional anger. But these agreements did not solve the central issue. They merely postponed it. Each compromise was really an admission that the nation could not agree on slavery, only delay the next confrontation. And each delay raised the stakes. Americans were no longer arguing over a temporary dispute. They were arguing over whether slavery would expand, whether free labor would spread, and whether the Union could survive while containing two fundamentally different social systems. The more politicians patched the nation together, the more obvious the crack became. Then the political system began to fail in public. The Kansas-Nebraska Act shattered earlier compromises by allowing settlers in new territories to decide the slavery issue for themselves. Instead of peace, it brought violence. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, and the territory descended into bloodshed. Bleeding Kansas showed the nation that the argument over slavery was no longer confined to speeches and legislation. Americans were now killing one another over it. At the same time, the old party system began to break apart. Political alliances that once linked North and South could no longer hold. A new Republican Party rose in the North, organized around opposition to the expansion of slavery. To many Southerners, that was a direct threat to their future power and security. As the 1850s went on, the conflict grew even more intense because it became openly moral as well as political. Abolitionists denounced slavery as a profound evil. Formerly enslaved people published first-hand accounts that exposed its cruelty. Anti-slavery books and speeches reached larger audiences and stirred deeper outrage in the North. Meanwhile, many Southern leaders hardened their defense of slavery. They no longer described it merely as an unfortunate necessity. More and more, they defended it as a positive good and as the foundation of their civilization. That shift made compromise far more difficult. This was no longer simply a disagreement over law or economics. It was a clash between two societies that increasingly believed the other threatened its values, its future, and its very existence. Several explosive events pushed the nation even closer to rupture. In the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories, convincing many Northerners that slaveholding interests had captured the federal government. Then, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry terrified the South. Brown hoped to spark a slave uprising, but his attack instead deepened Southern fear that violent anti-slavery extremism was closing in. These moments destroyed what little trust remained. The North increasingly believed slavery was spreading beyond all limits. The South increasingly believed its enemies wanted not only to stop slavery's expansion, but to destroy Southern society itself. The two sections were now living in different political realities, driven by different fears, and imagining different futures. The final breaking point came with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Lincoln did not campaign on immediate abolition where slavery already existed, but he did oppose its expansion into the Western territories. For many Southern leaders, that was enough. They believed his election proved that they had lost lasting control of the national government. If slavery could no longer expand, they feared it would eventually be placed on the road to extinction. Rather than remain in a union they no longer trusted, Southern states began to secede. They did not wait for slavery to be abolished. They left because they believed its future was under threat. Secession was the final political decision made after decades of escalating sectional conflict and collapsing national compromise. The Civil War came because the crisis had reached a point where neither side would accept the future offered by the other. The Confederacy demanded independence in order to protect a slaveholding order. The Union refused to recognize permanent disunion. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the long political crisis finally exploded into war. So why did the United States fall into civil war? Because slavery divided the nation at its deepest level. Because westward expansion turned that division into a struggle for power. Because compromise delayed the reckoning without removing the cause. And because by 1861, political collapse and sectional fear had destroyed the last fragile bonds holding the country together. The war was not caused by one moment alone. It was the explosion at the end of a long burning fuse,